I have a question about that, and this kind of gets to your corporate social responsibility. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get this out coherently. I'll do my best, but I'm trying to draw a few strands together because, when we talk about um, the sort of individual being, what's the term you use, privacy fatigue, or that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
apathy. Yeah,
Apathy, apathy, and just sort of like, kind of throwing their hands up at the complexity of it. I certainly think that's a major part of it, but I'm also wondering if there's an argument or perception maybe that kind of still has some roots in the experience after September 11th of the Patriot Act and kind
yeah,
of things that followed from that, where people basically said something like, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then there's nothing to worry about.
yeah.
And so that kind of seems to, in a weird way, I don't know, sort of circumvent the dignity argument, because it's something like, well, I should be able to monitor you, and the impetus is on you to not do anything wrong. And so it kind of shifts the perspective, and it's the premise is that there should be this kind of freedom to surveil, and the responsibility is on you to just make sure that you don't do anything unseemly in that surveillance context, but it kind of takes the surveillance context for granted. And so when you
Right.
talk about government, and specifically in the US context with the Patriot Act, I wonder how much of this, if any, what if you could break it down, maybe not as as precisely as a percentage, but something like, well, yeah, there's the impetus to want to kind of just let business go and innovate, and that kind of utilitarian ethos of just practical piecemeal dealing with things as they pop up. But then also, I mean, maybe, the idea with, I mean, if government is thinking like, well, we can also draw from these surveillance or the social media or these companies for our own interests in some way, and it's more of a, whose side are you on sort of
Right.
type of thing, in terms of the private citizen. So I'm wondering, I don't know if I got the question out right, but is there also an element to this that has to do with a something like a maybe oversimplified and maybe contrary to the dignity argument you're putting forward position that just says like, well, hey, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you don't have anything to worry about. And also the kind of utilitarian, well, we need to do this to catch bad actors who might be planning something, so
Yeah. I mean, that is, I guess, again, kind of a quintessential American view of why we should allow, this kind of, whether it's government surveillance or police action. And clearly after 9/11 and with the Patriot Act, there was this rush to opening things up. There were still some limits and restrictions, but this sense that the greater good's going to be served. If only we had better access to more data, maybe that could have been prevented. And then there was essentially, like a function creep where those practices started becoming more than just monitoring, potential terrorists overseas. It allowed monitoring internally. There were some famous, or infamous provisions that would allow access to library records or other kinds of things of people in the U.S. And then gag rules applied to that as well, where where people weren't
rules?
A gag rule, where, for
What's
example, a library would be restricted from saying that the FBI came to ask for someone's records. So in just I used to do a lot of work with libraries and privacy, and as a funny, clever response to this, libraries started putting up, they were called like privacy canaries. So like a canary in a coal mine, and once the canary dies, you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
They would put up a sign that says the FBI has not been here today, and then eventually the sign would disappear. And that was like they're not affirming it, but they're the negative gets the point across. But this did start to then pivot back after the Edward Snowden revelations. And I think that's suddenly when those that were making if you have nothing to hide, don't worry about it argument, suddenly realized this was more than just, Google looking at my Gmail content or Facebook, looking at my photos. It was the government having direct access to network traffic in ways that circumvented warrants and circumvented the traditional court process. And so even those more aligned, with the conservative view suddenly saw that as a threat, that this was going too far. And I think, you were alluding
Yeah,
to.
there used to be this term that was something, it was like probable cause or something like
Right,
that,
right,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm just thinking of something basic, like, a police officer pulls you over and they can't
yep,
just say, hey, let me look in your trunk, they gotta have some reason to,
yeah.
or at least that's how I thought it was, but it
And
seems like,
instead it turned into just fishing expeditions. Let's collect everything because you never
yeah,
know what you're gonna find.
right. So the analogy would almost be like, not even that they can pull you over and look in your trunk whenever they want, but they can just cruise by your house whenever they, or the whole
Yeah,
neighborhood, and go into every car and just look around. I mean,
yeah, because you never know what might be there.
right,
Um,
yeah.
and then, and to even extend it further, they would collect more than they even knew what to do with. Because maybe 5 years from now, we'll figure out how to use that data. So it was this
Mm,
very like almost over collection that was happening. And the CIA even admitted this because they would build these data centers. They're called fusion centers, where they were just gathering data, even encrypted data that they didn't know how to unencrypt, but they were guessing that maybe in 10 years they would figure it out. So let's just keep the data anyway, because it might become useful later on. And again, if you're in law enforcement, there's a logic to that, because you never know what's going to be the important piece of data to figure something out. And in their views, if they can do it securely in a way that doesn't violate privacy, they see that as a minimal risk. The concern for my community is that there's always going to be a risk. You never know what's going to happen to that data.
yeah, who
You
might
know,
get their hands on it, or,
right, yeah, yeah,
well, but there's your point too about the dignity, just, well, I mean, you don't
exactly,
have a
yeah,
right to that, really.
right. And that is kind of the fundamental question, like what kind of society do you want to be in terms
And so
of,
it sounds
yeah.
like Europe has taken a pretty decisively different direction in terms of this. And I'm wondering maybe if, so is this something that has any kind of significant partisan distinction in the US, or is this more kind of, you know, because I'm thinking about previous elections in my lifetime and so forth, and I don't know that I've ever seen this really elevated to one of the primary, sort of issues discussed to the
No,
degree you'd think it would be.
yeah, it really hasn't. There was a small time during the Obama administration when there was a privacy law that was introduced. I think it was by Senator Leahy's office. That was meant to be kind of a universal privacy rule. But the lobbying and the interests from, basically from the corporate and technology side, was able to push that down. That it would just it would inhibit. That's the argument, that it would inhibit their development, and it might. And that's honestly, that's a decision Europe has made, and some in Europe aren't happy with that because they see all the development and all the revenue that American companies are making off of data, and European companies are actually quite limited in what they can do with data. And so they see that as an economic disadvantage. And so that's a really interesting clash of values, in terms of, privacy or individual autonomy
Mhm.
versus, economic growth and development of a region. And that's a really interesting, kind of balance.